and in keeping of them there is great reward. For to be desired are they than gold. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. For to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, and the honeycomb.
Welcome back, everybody, to our journey through the book of Acts. We're getting very close to the end, second from last chapter now. So it's exciting to see how everything wraps up here. So let's just turn to Acts chapter 27 and read the chapter together, and then we'll go through pieces of it. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to the land. The rest were to get there on planks or pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. Absolutely incredible story. It's almost like reading a novel, but it makes it even more exciting because we know it's true. All these events are not fiction, they're true. So it's great. So just piecing pieces of it out of this chapter, verses 1 to 8, we read about the kindness of this centurion that had towards Paul himself. Partly likely because Paul was a Roman citizen and they wanted to treat them with equal rights as themselves. And so he had a lot of respect for Paul. But also I think a lot of that respect stood because of what he saw in Paul, how he saw Paul's character, how he talked, and he knew that he was a godly man, and he gave him the respect that a godly man deserves by giving him certain privileges and rights to meet with those that he was hoping to meet with. So that was really good to see the centurion being kind and open in his mind like that. Paul was different from the other prisoners likely because most of those prisoners were likely criminals who were actually going to be sent to the arena. Remember the games where the gladiators people would go to the arena and they would watch people fight for fun and pay to see that. Well, most of those prisoners who were criminals especially were sent there, and it was pretty much a death sentence at the expense of their lives, and it was all for the entertainment of the Roman citizens, unfortunately. So that was the difference between Paul and the other criminals, likely, just to set the scene a little bit. 9 to 12, verses 9 to 12 remind us of Paul's voice not really being heard. He gave some very wise advice, but because of his experience, he'd actually been shipwrecked 3 times already before this event. So he knew the seas, he knew what was wise or not, because he'd experienced it before. So, but unfortunately, and it almost makes natural sense that the centurion followed the instructions of the chief sailor and the owner of the ship. Usually that's what you tend to do. They're the ones who are supposed to know the seas, know the vessel, what it can handle. So the centurion did what most people would. However, unfortunately, that, as we know, led to the post events. So Fair Havens was a place not ideal to stop. However, there was also risks on carrying on. And so we will have this in times in life, and many times, to be honest, where we'll have two different risks. And a situation where there's two risks, and there's going to be one with greater risks than another, and it's about discerning and figuring out which is the greater risk and what to do. And unfortunately, the Paul was not heard at that time as much as he really knew what he was talking about, and maybe others didn't really know his experiences, so they didn't really know that he knew as much as he did. Verses 13 to 20 of this chapter, it shows that they made a good start. They thought they had made the right decision, and it was a good choice to carry on. However, things quickly got out of hand, as we read, and there was a great storm that came. And the sailors themselves knew that this was a bad situation, from what they could see. That they weren't. They were smart people too, and they could see that it was not good. And it was so dire that Dr. Luke, who is presumably the writer of Acts of what we're reading, he had doctor kind of skills, is what history tells us. And even he, who maybe wasn't used to this kind of work, it seems like he was helping them with certain tasks, like bringing the skiff off the back of the boat. That was something usually trailed behind the boat, and they had to bring that in, and they were hoisting it in, and he was helping with that. And they were putting cables under the boat to kind of wrap all of the wood together to try and keep the boat together in that storm. So there was lots of things going on in this major storm, and things were really getting out of hand. And they were very concerned about hitting these Syrtis sands, which is somewhere off the north coast of Africa. And these sands were feared by sailors. It was kind of like, as we know, the Bermuda Triangle is today. It was kind of a piece where ships were destroyed many, many times. And so they were in a very dire situation. And it seemed now at this point there was no way out, except with their faith and hope in God to save them. So this was a key moment again when people are in a situation where they're trying to do everything their own way, and just at the last minute they realize that we're helpless. What can we do? Oh yes, how about we contact our Creator who can help with all of these things. So now they're at God's mercy for their lives. So what happened next? Verses 21 to 26, it is when Paul gives his speech, you could say. And he addresses the crew about what God told him was going to happen through the angel. And that was wonderful, that God would show his grace and to Paul that way, to address these sailors, to encourage them. Very gracious. Once again, we see God's grace and mercy very evident here. And so the crew were able to listen to Paul and realize that not all hope was lost. Now notice that Paul said, I believe God. He didn't say, I believe in God. Even the devil believes in God. Lots of people believe in God. those that don't follow God believe in God. But he said, I believe God. There's a difference, isn't there? And that's something for us to think about, that we actually believe what God has said is true and is going to take place, or is evident, and that's something we can all learn from. Now, also in Paul's speech, Paul said, take it to heart. He took it to heart. Paul cared about the sailors. He had not written any of the sailors off, and that's very important. Paul could have been caring just about himself, that he made the journey there himself, but he didn't. He made sure that he took the opportunity to show his care for the rest of the crew. No matter what their background, no matter what they'd done, he wanted to encourage the whole crew. He wanted to be sure and encourage them that they were all going to be safe at God's hands. And it was a moment he could use to share the gospel, and maybe he did in his own way. We don't read of it exactly, but even what he was doing was demonstrating his faith and his faith in God. And it's important when we show care to others that we show it sincerely. And it's not just something we say, but it's something we show and we do. And this is something we can see is evident in Paul's circumstance here. He wasn't just saying it, he was showing it by his actions. Verses 27 to 38. So Paul addresses the crew once again. He's noticed that there's people trying to escape, and he's basically saying, you got to stop them. There's a few reasons why. They're experienced guys. We'll need them on board to make sure we get to where we need to go. But there might have been another reason. There might have been a reason that God had spoken to him. You need to make sure everybody stays together. You need to make sure that you do it my way for everybody to be saved, to everybody be safe. And we need to have everybody involved and trusting God in this situation. And so they did. They stopped them. They cut the ropes to get rid of that lifeboat so nobody could try and escape that way. So that was very important too, because sometimes if we do try to do it our own way when God has already showed us the way, then maybe his plan could be thwarted because of our actions trying to do it ourselves. And what he wants to give us, he can't, because we have got in the way of it. We ourselves have got in the way. I also love this bit in this section here between verses 27 and 38 we're still talking about, where he broke bread with them. He told them that they need to eat. They'd likely been so occupied with trying to stay on board the ship and not drown and be thrown overboard. He said, you need to eat. He used that opportunity, possibly even for himself, to remember the Lord as Jesus had asked his followers to do. Yes, this was not exactly how it was supposed to go, but he did what he could in the circumstances he was in to be able to remember the Lord. And he broke bread with them, and he gave thanks to God in front of them all, it says, in front of them all. And they were encouraged by it. They were encouraged. So even those who aren't fully on board or don't fully understand your faith, they can still be encouraged by what they witness, what they see, And that's a stepping stone to where they need to be. Verses 39 to 44. God fulfills His promise to them. And isn't it amazing that even those who were not able to swim were able to make it safely? Usually that wouldn't be the case. It's very easily to sink fast when you don't know how to swim. But they were given wise instructions to grab something that was like a flotation device in today's terms. And they were able to get to land safety. And God's promise was fulfilled. Absolutely amazing. Now, what I'd like to just summarize as a piece I really would like for us to think about and remember today is that there was a change in the wind in this story, both literally and metaphorically. Originally, there was smooth sailing and everything was fine. But Paul, in his experience of being on the seas, knew that it was not a good idea to keep going in the situation they were in. But he wasn't listened to. However, later on he was listened to. I wonder why that is. The winds changed from not very, not too bad to something terrible. And not only that, the hearts and the trust of the men changed from not listening to Paul to listening to him, taking his advice. And I think that is something we as Christians, as the Lord's servants, can consider on a day-to-day basis. That our faith without the works to show it is not strong. It's not very evident. We need evidence of our faith in our day-to-day life to affect those around us, to change the winds of those around us. And it can take time. Something very there's a thread that runs through a lot of situations that we can consider, and we're going to consider one just now. But Jeff already mentioned a couple of people this morning. Joseph. Joseph was a man where the winds changed into his favor, but it took time. A long time. At least 2 years he was in prison waiting to hear that answer before he was able to be in a position where he could really change things for people. David. People followed him. Why did they follow him? Because they didn't just hear about his faith, they saw it. And over time, he built up his followers. He built up his men to be mighty men, to be a force that could not be reckoned with when David was listening to the Lord. But I'd just like to touch on one story in particular as we just read it together in Daniel. We just read Daniel together, and it's one of the most famous stories I know. When he was in the lion's den, and we know what happened, right? But we're not going to read the leading up to it. We're going to read what happens after it. So, we'll read from Daniel chapter 6, verse 17, just a few verses. So this was after Daniel had been thrown in the den for continuing to pray to the Lord despite the new decree that had been put out by the subjects and king himself. So verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Isn't that great? Do you see the winds change in this? Do you see the king? He was in his distress, and had he have been wise about it originally, he wouldn't have even thrown Daniel in. He would have realized the mistake he did realize what he'd done, and that's why he couldn't sleep that night. But he was overjoyed. And instead of making that decree prior to Daniel being put in, he put out a new decree that honored Daniel and, more importantly, honored God. We have the ability to change people around us, to change kings, to change the next door neighbor. We're so sorry to see what's going on in the world, aren't we? But the winds can change. I'd like us to just finally read from James chapter 2 together. James chapter 2, and from verse 14. "What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, 'Go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds.' Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. You believe that there is one God. Good, even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish men, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Did you notice that piece in what we just read together? About being complete. And his faith was made complete by what he did. And called God's friend for it. You know, there's a reason Paul was on that boat. There's a reason you and I are where we are. There's a reason God gave us the gift of faith to help those around us, to change the wind for people, and to help God save them. Let's pray.
You have tried the paths of worldly pleasure, sought for peace the world can never give. Oh, be careful where you place your treasure. You need one to teach you how to live. Try Jesus, he never, never fails, or even his love forevermore prevails. In sunshine or in the stormy gales, try Jesus, he never fails. Time is short, the moments swiftly flying. Money cannot buy sweet peace within. You are longing, seeking, sighing.